All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to What Security Measures Do I Need to Protect My Business webinar, brought to you in partnership with Veeam and Duo Security. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce the people we have today on our panel. Brandon, let's start with you, sir.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeremy. Good to be here once again. My name is Brandon McCoy. I'm a senior system engineer at Veeam Software. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Been here about 4 years, and I support all of our Veeam cloud and service providers.
Fantastic. Seth, over to you.
Hey folks, my name is Seth. I've been with Duo for about 5 years, and I'm now head of business development on our channel side. My passion is really talking about multi-factor authentication and working with partners to protect our customers.
Fantastic, fantastic. Jason, thank you for joining us again.
Yes, glad to be here. My name is Jason Pullman. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture here at Otava. I've been with the company more than about 5.5 years. And before that, I was on the ops side, so I hope to bring some unique perspective here today, both from Otava side and ops side for the team here today.
Fantastic. And by order of introduction, my name is Jeremy Bigler. I'll be your moderator today. With that said, let's jump into why we're here. So I'm sure if I polled everybody out here in the audience today, we'd all agree, right? We've seen and heard ongoing issues around cybercrime and similar exploits being perpetrated really pervasively before the pandemic, but certainly spiking during pandemic, and now as we start to get into recovery mode, we see that same behavior continuing. A couple of the key things here, right? Target. We saw that even with an organization that was well protected, at least in terms of perception, with $100 million of cyber liability insurance, their actual cost and exposure was 3 times that. And that continues to mount as they continue to recover and remediate that issue. Big organizations aren't the only targets out there, right? We're all familiar with the Colonial Pipeline incident, but even in schools, public sector, we recently saw several police departments being hacked. So the landscape of threat exposure here extends into almost every niche that we have. Team, any thoughts here, any perspectives that you bring from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to look at here is sometimes the coverage also gets distorted in terms of, novel attacks getting the most coverage. And there's an analogy actually to car accidents in a way. There are a lot of fender benders out there, and they can be very disruptive to, a person's life. But there are also, some accidents that are fatal as well. Breaches are like that too. They follow the power law. So there's some very large breaches, right, that actually, affect an entire organization. But it's just as important for businesses to have kind of broad-based protection against those small intrusions that can eventually spiral out of control.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here as well. So, lots of different ransomware stories, as Seth was mentioning. Some get more publicity than the other ones. The Colonial Pipeline, that hit me personally because I live in Georgia here, and so it's hard to get gas there for a few days. So it's not just affecting these businesses, but also people in their everyday lives. What's really interesting is if you look at this ransomware on the city of Baltimore, this is actually the second time that it has happened to them by the same people, and they actually decided not to pay the ransom. And when the mayor was asked why, the FBI had told him not to do that. And one of the big reasons is I was just reading this interesting study, and I'm actually going to drop this link in the chat if you'd like to read more about it. But it says that 80% of organizations that pay the ransom get hit again by the exact same criminals. So it's an interesting thing. And I think a big reason is because a lot of times these companies can't find all of the back doors that those cyber criminals may have came in from. So even if they do pay the ransom and maybe they get their data back, maybe they don't, but they don't know that all of those doors have been closed and locked. And so there's a really good chance that they're going to get hit again. And in the case of the city of Baltimore, they decided to just blow everything away and get all new IT infrastructure. Unfortunately, they still got hit again, and that does seem to be a trend. And I'll leave you with the fact that this year, I believe ransomware as a whole is expected to reach about $20 billion in damage for reputation, cost, business, et cetera.
And just to follow on that, Brandon, briefly, you mentioned Baltimore replacing their IT infrastructure. Well, one of the commonalities there is the people, and people make mistakes. But the Verizon data breach report found that 85% of the almost 30,000 cyber incidents they studied involved some human element, whether that was phishing, right, falling prey to a phishing email, opening a malicious attachment. And so one of the things we'll talk about when we get to preparedness is, assuming that people make mistakes, how do you prepare your business to prevent or respond to those incidents?
So one question that came in, team, from the attendees here is when we think about security, right? Oftentimes we're making a pitch to senior executive leadership within an organization, and what do we hear, right? We see the pain, right? But what do we hear typically in terms of pushback from that group around why they wouldn't want to protect themselves or move in that direction?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, Seth, I didn't know you were going to jump in there. One of the things I see, and this is to a specific segment, but the age-old, my data is safe because it's in the cloud. We see tons of Office 365 ransoms, whether that is an actual ransomware attack from an outside organization or a malicious employee. As Seth mentioned, the human element is very pervasive in a lot of these, whether that's malicious or accidental, et cetera. So just understanding that, the cloud is just somebody else's computer. I think that's a big one we get is helping people understand that needs to be protected as well.
For the longest time, there has been a trade-off. There will continue to be a trade-off between security and convenience. When I, come back home, get out of the car, I've got to enter in my code or, use my key to get in the door. It would be nice if I could just waltz right through. And that's the pushback we continue to see. Fortunately, like the security landscape has changed. It's very competitive, and there are products out there that can reduce friction for users. It's the initial change that a lot of the service providers and the customers can get really anxious about. They've heard about flood of help desk tickets, the upfront investment in infrastructure, hopefully you have a conversation with Otava and see that actually the transition can be smoother than you may have expected.
Yeah, Jeremy, what we see with a lot of our pursuits is that there wasn't a budget in place. And so in taking and escalating the conversation upward in any organization, it's using facts, and it's using facts to inform that pursuit itself, and to present it's not just, hey, we may have to pay a ransomware here. There is a cost per data breach. And I'm going to give some sites here in just a little bit where you can go, or actually the true cost of a medical record or another record like that. There are reports out there that you can use that information, as well as, there's one on here for Target. I mean, this happened several years ago, but every time I go to Target, it still pops in my head. So there can be also damage to brand recognition as well, not just a ransomware attack, not just the cost of the breach, but also the cost to damage to brand as well.
So you mentioned data, Jason, and thank you. I think one of the things that we think about, right, is how do we think about the scope of risk, right? And we think about security as really risk mitigation. We can't eliminate it. It's never going to go away entirely. But what we can do is make ourselves less of a target than someone else, right? And unfortunately, to speak candidly, team, that is really our best security strategy. Make ourselves as small of a risk profile as we possibly can. We see some significantly sobering numbers here, right? Comparatively to just a few months ago, last year, 148% increase in simply magnitude of attacks. 66% spike based on world events, right? COVID was a big accelerator here. We think about a lot of our workforce and understand that according to Gartner, 74% of businesses do not plan on returning fully to work, right? They plan on adopting or continuing a hybrid or remote work strategy. So the same phenomenon that led us into this higher risk posture of having folks work from a remote or potentially unsecured home or other environment will perpetuate. It's not just a COVID scenario. So that's something to keep in mind. And then we think about the types of risk magnitude or impact of that risk, right? 13% in energy, 10% in healthcare, 8%, right? These are the verticals with the longest time to identify and resolve a breach, right? And we think about the magnitude of impact there, or potential magnitude of impact. That's significant. Thoughts here, team, on how we should really think about the risk facing our organizations, and then how do we talk about that risk to decision makers?
One of the things to keep in mind here is as these attacks increase, there is a vastly different level of sophistication that an attack can be run at. So for example, we've all heard of, state actors and intelligence agencies, attacking other nations. Those are tending to be a higher level of sophistication. But for someone running, SMB or mid-market business, you're probably looking at the broader based attacks where the level of sophistication is lower, but they cast a really wide net. And so there's some really simple things you can do that have a lower impact on, employees' everyday experience, their experience of IT tools. But when you pick that low-hanging fruit, you're getting a lot of the security benefit. So obviously, we think at Duo that includes multi-factor authentication, because that Verizon data breach report said more than 60% of the attacks it studied involved compromised credentials. And one more thing I'll add here is that even if an attack starts with a third-party software vulnerability or a poor configuration of a cloud application, once the attackers see that they've penetrated, they have access, they're looking for usernames and passwords stored in notepads or in documents. So it's all about that lateral movement and preventing that after the initial penetration.
And I'll piggyback off what Seth was saying. It's funny that he mentioned the level of sophistication, because I was just thinking about I do another ransomware webinar where it talks about the history of ransomware, and I think it was in like 1989, where there was just a floppy disk that would lock your computer and ask you to send like $189 to a Panamanian PO box, right? Because they didn't have cryptocurrencies then. And now we see ransomware as a service. And as I say, any good cyber hacker who's worth their weight in Bitcoin, they're not only going to lock your production environment up, but they're going to look for those Veeam files or whatever software that you're using. They're aware of this, right? So you have to go further than just having one backup, which we'll get into some of that later. And then lastly, on the compromised credentials. So when I talk to someone who even was using Veeam but still got hacked, one of the big things was I installed Veeam on my production domain, and I just used global admin, for the account. And so once they come in through Active Directory, not only are they able to lock out that production environment, but they're able to delete the server that's called backup server, right? So definitely those credentials are a big piece, and understanding that the backups need to be protected correctly too. Yep.
Good points. Good points. I think we think about our landscape, right? What are some of the commonalities that we see across these? How do we how do we think about these in trends, or really looking at a predictive state, right? How should we take the data that we have today in hand and think about where this could be going?
Yeah, Jeremy, I'll take this just to start out here. I mean, the slide says certain verticals here, but it applies to everybody nowadays. I think that's what we're finding across all verticals, not just certain ones. And everybody has resource constraints within their IT department. It's a cost center, so a lot of times the IT department doesn't have that big budget. I just read something the other day that if you're a security professional, you name your salary. That's how big it is today. And that's something to be said, that every organization should have somebody that can focus and develop a program and or a framework around a security practice, because it is not only a top need, but top of mind, but for every business out there now, not just these certain verticals. What we're seeing is that, and it's not just, well, I don't have, 80 payments coming in for PCI, so I don't need that. I don't have any medical records, I don't need that. But if you really dig into some of these compliance structures, you really see how they really provide you that framework for your security. And I believe later on this deck, we're going to provide a framework that we offer to help make those decisions and guide those decisions on how to best protect your infrastructure.
Makes sense. So from a let's start with really a foundation security, right, Jason? You said something interesting there, which is if I'm not a payment card processor or a healthcare organization, how should I still think about security? And that, I think, sets the basis for really a foundation level perspective here around security. Can you take us through that quickly?
I can. A lot of this stuff is really some basic practices, right? But it's down to the basics, and we still hear a lot of folks saying, um, I'm sorry to bring up any bad feelings here, but they're still running an older version of an OS that's still unsupported, and that's just the number one flag right there. Uh, Keep all your software up to date, and it's not only just the OSs, but you got to consider, any utility applications that your ops teams use, any sales enablement tools that your sales teams use. So it's just not the OS. And some people just think, well, I got my OS covered because I got my report right here that says everything's good. But it's those ancillary apps that your different departments use that you also have to be aware of. We heard what here recently with SolarWinds. A lot of people are customers of SolarWinds. I'm a former one. So you just got to be careful, not just of the OSs, but all your application sets. Perform a threat analysis. There's awesome tools out there. Nessus is probably one that everybody's familiar with. With Nessus, you can scan up to, I think, 15, 16 IPs just to get a feel for it. It's a great tool to do a threat analysis of your entire environment and then to stack rank those issues so you can get those addressed. I would also recommend, when it says train staff on cybersecurity practices, but also have a response team and have response team meetings. And a lot of folks, a lot of shops don't have those resources, as we mentioned in the previous slide, resource constraints being a problem. But if you don't have that team together, assemble it. Take control of that. It's really simple just to have a practice, a bi-weekly meeting, just to talk about things that are going on out in the wild out here, things to watch out for, and then also review that threat analysis response or report that you may get from whatever tool you're going to be using with the team, just so you have awareness around that. There's a lot of shops that still don't have an incident response team that should be top of mind. The stuff of limiting by strong passwords. Brandon brought an example of using a global admin. I think we all know you shouldn't do that. Be careful, your domain admin groups, inspect those and make sure that everybody that is in there should have the rights and they have a reason to be in there. That domain ad group shouldn't have but maybe one or two user IDs within that group, if that. That's a bad practice if anybody is still using domain admins. And like Brandon said, that you're just setting yourself up for disaster if that does happen. let's see here. The 3-2-1. I really like this, and it's not just 3-2-1-1-0. Excuse me, 3-2-1, but it is 3-2-1-1-0, and those 1-0s are just as important as the 3-2-1 there. And you can see what we're talking about. But the 1-0 really is having an offline copy, and not only having a copy, but making sure that you can recover from that. We used to say you're only as good as your last backup, but your last backup that you tested, I recover from. We've had several customers where thankfully, they had a offline copy. They were attacked. We ended up. I like the analogy that I heard just the other day that we were like a tow truck, and we helped pull them out of the muck or the mud. This particular customer I'm talking about, they got hit pretty hard. Thankfully, they had offline backups. We were able to take all those backups, get them into our cloud, and get them up and running. So having offline copies and just making sure we can recover from those copies is a best practice here. And that kind of goes into the recovery. But I'm going to pass it over to Seth and Brandon here for some commentary on these items as well.
Yeah, thanks for setting that up, Jason. I think, to keep it at a very high level, you want to think of, as cliche as this is, think of security as a journey and not a destination. There will not be some point in the future, 18 months, where you are secure, whereas now you are insecure. So it's a question of, okay, what are the simple things I can do quickly? What can I deploy, in the next 3 months that will substantially cut down on my risk? Some of those things, fortunately, are free. So the principle of least privilege, just look around your environment and say, who has access to what applications? Can they provision additional users? Who has the ability to create bypass codes, right, to get into other applications? And saying, do they really need that level of access? Again, that cuts down on the ability of attackers to move laterally within an environment. The other high level thing when we talk about preparedness, there's an analogy to aviation safety here, which is you have to assume, or transportation safety in general, you have to assume people will make mistakes, right? You get in a car and you forget to turn your lights on. Well, we have automatic lights now, right? The dash is not going to light up. The same thing with people, storing their passwords on a notepad. Assume that's going to get stolen. What's the next layer of security standing between an attacker and access to an application? Obviously multi-factor comes into play there, but there are lots of other things to consider. The very last thing I'll say here is it's not going to be perfect. For practical reasons, you may find yourself compromising in places. So, at Duo, we don't recommend that folks share, administrator usernames and passwords across multiple people, but sometimes that's just what you got to do in the interim. And so if you're sharing usernames and passwords, you have that second factor to actually verify who was using that credential. And that's a really important thing to get done as well.
Yeah, and a couple things from the Veeam side of the house. So we look at this have mixed types of repositories, not a fail-safe, but definitely a good practice. Typically, we don't see a lot of bilingual ransomware codes, right? So it's either for one type of repository or the other. But from a Veeam perspective, in version 11, we did just recently release Linux hardened repositories, so with immutability. So what this means is that the first time you install Veeam and you connect your Linux repository, we do need those credentials. Oftentimes, those are going to be the root pseudo credentials, but we can do a one-time single sign-on to install the Veeam services on that repository and then no longer store those credentials, and then check a box to make those backups immutable, which means that they can't be deleted, nor can they be written to for the amount of time that you specify. A couple other things in terms of ransomware monitoring. So our product Veeam One does have a possible ransomware monitoring alert. If we see high CPU spikes or high data store writes, that alarm would go off. You could also have a script to power off that machine in that case. Yeah, and then just lastly, one other thing, I'm going to drop this in the chat, and this is kind of a little shout out to Seth and Duo, telling him that our Veeam software, our core product, doesn't have multi-factor authentication in the software, so we do recommend using something like Duo to go ahead and apply the 2FA to the Veeam server itself. And I dropped that in the chat too if any of you guys are interested in learning how to do that with Veeam and Duo.
Fantastic. And then team, the one thing that I think is important to think about, right, is given that we're in a global economy, given that we're in a, we think about our supply chains, right, for bringing products and services to market, and how we consume products and services as a part of that supply process, right, and the integration of other organizations. Now, specifically, as we start to interact with IT level integration between suppliers, distributors, and other parties, how does this impact really? We don't have an island anymore. We don't have a wall around our organization. How do we think about that multi-party, multi-stakeholder security portfolio?
So not having all your eggs in one basket, there is something to be said for that. The idea here is that if I have one vendor like Microsoft, I'm using their Azure Active Directory, right? Any vendor, assume any vendor can be compromised. That is not a paranoid thing. It's just a practical thing. And SolarWinds may be an exception here, right? Because they actually, breach the software development process. But I'm going to put that aside for a moment and say it is less likely, right, that multiple security vendors will be compromised at once. So having a portfolio of products in your environment from different vendors that are developed in different environments, there is an incremental benefit to that. Now, again, I'm all about practicality though. If the easiest thing for you to do today is to turn on multi-factor authentication from Microsoft, do that. Use the native MFA if it comes with the application, that you're currently employing. So when it comes to the interaction of vendors, it may feel like, well, I don't want to juggle, so many different providers, but there is an incremental benefit to having multiple ones.
When we think about this, Seth, that's something good to keep in our mind here. We think about this in the context of tool sets, but also as we start to let people into our environment, right? We bring in subcontractors, we bring in third parties, right? The Target example is a great example where the main point of entry was not Target. It was a subcontractor that Target had hired that got them access into, them meaning the perpetrators, into the back-end systems. How do we think about securing that ecosystem?
Yeah, the Target example is a perfect example of not following zero trust. And honestly, some of the zero trust concepts were just kind of coming out then. And so it's understandable that a large retailer like Target fell victim to that. What Target had was a VPN, right? And attackers got access into that internal environment. Where they failed to implement zero trust, where we'll explain here, is once the attackers were in the environment, it was assumed that they were trusted, right? They were able to move into other applications. They were able to get into, somehow steal info from the point of sale systems. All those things should have been segmented off. Even with single sign-on in place, you still want to have steps and checks. Not just verifying the identity of the user with MFA. That is a phenomenal first step. We highly recommend it. But also thinking about the health of their device. And increasingly with remote work, your customers or your internal environment, you don't necessarily control, right, the devices they're accessing your cloud applications from. When I talk about the attack surface of O365, it's like any computer from anywhere in the world. That is a very broad attack surface. But hey, like we're here for it. What you can do with a product like Duo or some other endpoint security products is not just push out updates to the managed devices, but run a check as a user is accessing an application, is that laptop secure? Or are they coming from their kid's iPad, that's running, iOS 9 or something like that? The next is policies and controls. Do you have any employees who are coming in from overseas, logging in from, just to choose a random country, Madagascar? If not, it might might make sense to set up a geofence, right? Filter by IP address. Everyone on this call, I assume, knows that IP addresses can be easily faked. But just like the Nigerian prince emails, where they are intentionally written so that no one with kind of security knowledge would fall for it, some of these attacks don't even filter out their IP, because if you're looking at that, you probably have other security measures in place. So there's a lot built into this zero trust journey, but again, it's something you can do step by step, increasing security all along the way. And I'll pass it along to the Otava folks to kind of round out the story.
So one of the things I think here that is interesting as well, right, is going back to, you had mentioned this a little bit, Seth, right, the concept of least privilege, right? Once we open that door to folks, what should they have access to, right? And curate that entire journey through our back end environment, not just at the point of entry or exit. The other piece in here too, right, is a lot of the issues that we've seen historically in these breaches have been social engineering based point of origin, right? Hi, I'm Joe from IT. I need help resetting your account. You're locked out. Hey, can you tell me what your current username and password are so I can go ahead and reset that, right? Pretty basic example of social engineering. But this really reinforces the need for us as a security-minded organization to constantly reaffirm and to retrain, especially now that we have diverse or distributed workforce, that the concept of what social engineering looks like, where points of origin can be, right? If you get an email, and a funny story, I'll talk about internal Otava for a minute, right? Our internal IT group, trying to do their best to keep us secure, sent out a link for us to download to update device discovery on company-owned devices. Perfectly legitimate email. But in 15 minutes, they had, number of responses from our internal team saying, hey, you sent me a link, I'm not clicking on it. What's going on here? Is this really what should be happening? That type of reaction should be what we see in any situation that doesn't look or feel like a normal day-to-day. And I think that's a good testament to a highly evolved and aware social engineering security program. But that's something that I think is maybe understated in a lot of the organizations we deal with today. Jason, I'm curious if you've seen the same thing and speaking to clients and prospects out there.
Yes, certainly, Jeremy. The social engineering is, you can't train your end users enough. And I kind of go into the next slide, but with some of this commentary, but it's a challenge and continues to be a challenge. And across all spectrums, going back to making sure your users are aware of the threats, give them different scenarios to educate them, and give them an action plan to what to do. The example you just gave, we all knew that we need to send it to this security distro because that's how we've been trained. So my advice would be to make sure your user base knows what to do in those circumstances, and just reinforce that, especially on a monthly basis, is a good practice.
And last but not least here, I think one of the things we think about with zero trust, and really with just good preparedness, right, is ensuring that we're protected in the event that something may happen. Brandon, can you take us a minute through the really the concept of what is 32110 from start to finish, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So 3-2-1 is something I talk about every day in my job. So you have 3 copies of your data on 2 devices with 1 offsite. Sometime along the road, they decided to add the 1-0, as Jason was kind of alluding to. That could be your offline copy. Perhaps it's tape, or perhaps you're using the Otava cloud, maybe with something like insider protection to protect against malicious employees deleting or even accidentally deleting something. So that first copy of your data is actually your production data. The second copy is a local backup. And then the third copy, which is also the second type of media, which is also the offsite, is another backup, at another location, perhaps in the Otava cloud.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. And we talked, Jason, you just teased the concept of remote work, right? I'm remote. I'm sure probably many of us on this webinar are also working remote these days. What are some of the things that we can do to really secure, our environments away from the corporate perimeter?
Yeah, I think a lot of things is just going back to what I just mentioned is information and distribution of information. A lot of these people are going to say, yeah, I am doing this, or I got a hole here or there I need to plug. But really, what we noticed and what we heard, as the start of COVID and the remote workforce is, I understood my business impact. If my workers are here physically, but I don't understand my business impact if they're remote. And so I know we work with, and several of our partners in our ecosystem have worked with our customers to talk about what is the business impact analysis of the remote workforce. And here's some gaps that we've seen. And a lot of these bullets are touching on that, even the most simplistic things that you'd be surprised that report comes back with is as simple as the VPN. And not only just a VPN, but making sure you're doing some posture checking on that side. And that kind of touches into what we talked about earlier is not just your OS being fully patched, but any of your worker apps for your particular business units that you might need to check on. Those need to be updated as well. And you need to make sure those stay updated. So making sure that that perimeter is accessible, is secure, and you're actually sending out some sort of checking device to make sure, like a posture check from your VPN concentrator, and reporting out on that, making sure you understand, because a lot of people we talk to say, yeah, I got all these people connected, but I'm so worried about this app or that app or this vulnerability on that machine, where a simple posture checking strategy took care of that. Enforcing physical location. I'm going to go back to let's give an example here where you lock the doors. That's the basic. What we found is some people in certain buildings where they don't own the building, they lease it, or you're in a high rise. Usually the maintenance team of that facility has access, has that master key or that master code card. Be aware of that and making sure that if you don't know that, find that out, because that can lead to some bad situations if they have access and you don't know about it to your area, to your where your data sits, and that could be a vulnerability. So make sure you understand that physical security. As simple as that may seem, thinking, oh, I have that covered. Yes, we lock the door, but who has access to that door? So make sure you keep that in mind. And if you don't have anything sophisticated, a simple notepad on the door to log access in and out might help you or save you some downtime someday. Teach employees to secure their home Wi-Fi. That sounds so basic, and I think that coming from the outside, that's one of the biggest challenges is to make it easily consumable information to instruct them how to protect themselves. There's 5 simple things that you can do to make that easy. Checking access, allowing access, make sure it's password protected, make sure, of course, there's encryption enabled, and making sure they're using non-birthday or first name, middle name passwords. Make sure there's some sophistication there to the passwords that they're using. Basic security training. What we also find is that it's like I mentioned before, sometimes it's challenging, and people are your end users are working very hard and they're, oh, this is another information letter from IT. I'll get to it later because I'm working on this. Um, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. So what can you do? You got to reinforce that. Some other ways to reinforce that behavior is using what I've seen a lot of we've had advisement several times on this, but I've seen a lot of people put this in practice recently, and that is to any outside email outside the organization, they're putting in a warning, not down below in the footer now, but in the header that says this, be careful because this email originated from an outside source. Stuff that easy to reinforce that behavior is really what I've seen a lot of people embrace from working remotely. I mentioned about the posture checking with not just the OS software, but patches and updates for across different business units that may have their own productivity apps. Make sure you're aware of those. Having backups, right? It's, a lot of end users are working more locally now, or hopefully they're working in the cloud where you are backing up that. We mentioned backing up Office 365 earlier, making sure those backups are happening. You'll find a lot of people are still saving locally and try to understand that and provide them a method of protecting that data or training them to make sure they're using the productivity apps like you want them to use. I mentioned the contingency plans as part of the BIA because a lot of people didn't have that in place. They had it there for whenever the workforce was sitting, in a physical four-wall location, but not distributed. So they had to revisit those contingency plans. So I'd recommend that you do that and understand that if this, then that happens, and update those plans accordingly. And then set up multi-factor authentication. This is going to be a soft pitch to Seth here in just a second. But we use it for everything. And I'm not just talking about VPN access, server access, app access. We use it wherever we can to make sure that we're doing that authentication. Because like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people are using their birthdays or something else for passwords when stuff that even though we try to train, it's tough to control and reinforce that behavior. Well, multi-factor does that. So Seth, there's your soft pitch. Take us from here on the value of multi-factor here in a best practice scenario.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. So, one of the things that comes up here is not just multi-factor authentication in terms of the actual, entering your credentials and then you get a prompt, notification or enter a passcode. The security benefit there, of course, is we have an out of band or separate, something the user has in their possession in addition to something they know. So that's the concept. But one of the examples I like to use is why multi-factor authentication as a concept is great is title companies. So title companies, right, they're providing wire transfer information to, realtors and customers, and they've been, targeted for a lot of attacks because it would be great if I'm a malicious actor to, get into their email and provide, false info about where you're supposed to wire the money. And that's been done. Businesses have lost millions of dollars to that. So within your company, how secure is your process, right? Not just your software. Like if a vendor is sending you an email saying, hey, set us up differently in your system and start sending payments to this address, that should be an opportunity to give someone a call, do something out of band on a different channel. So just like you mentioned, Jason, like at Otava, when there was that download link and people were contacting corporate security, it's great to have a culture where if something looks even a little off, we'll find a separate channel and just confirm, hey, you're asking me to do this. Does that sound like the right thing? And that also gets people in a mindset where something small, in our opinion, like multi-factor authentication, doesn't feel like a hassle. Instead, it's a good feeling, right? It's like, okay, great. Like I'm being verified. No one else can get in. Only I can because I've got this key or this phone.
So one of the things I think that there's also a lot of misperception about in the industry today, right, is cyber liability insurance. And so we're not attorneys. We're not going to give you legal advice, right? I would recommend a good IT knowledgeable attorney, but couple guiding principles, right? With cyber liability, number one, buy as much as you can afford. You can never have enough, and why I say that is threefold. First, we saw with the example that Target had, where they're now triple the amount of their original cyber insurance policy. And that cyber insurance policy is not just a blanket policy, it's structured to protect portions of the business in certain ways. So what may be large, right, a typical $1 million policy, for example, may only give certain percentage protection in certain areas of the organization. Talk to a broker that understands your business and understands IT, right? One of the biggest challenges we see with cyber insurance, understand that insurance companies are not in the business to give away money, they're in the business to protect money. So make sure that you and they are dealing around a knowledgeable core discussion and foundation, and that you're actually doing what you represent you do when you apply for that policy. There's going to be a fairly exhaustive questionnaire that you're going to have to comply and complete. And it's going to ask you what you do to ensure security within your organization. And any derivation of your actual operational processes to what you're representing can void that policy. Secondarily, understand that you may be covering your downstream clients' liabilities as well. If a cause or causality or hack occurs in your organization, you may have culpability downstream to other people that may be impacted by that. So your cyber liability policy may have to extend in an umbrella model to those organizations as well. And then finally, ensure that any vendor or any partner that you do business with has their own blanket policy, and that they are ensuring that they're protected at the same degree as you are or optimally higher. And you want to make sure that when you're talking to this, engage your attorney, make sure you're talking to somebody that has an IT background or construct. It can help navigate this to make sure that the protection you think you're getting, you are actually receiving as part of that policy. Team, anything here you'd like to add color to?
Yeah, Jeremy, I'd like just to add to that last bullet that you mentioned, and just to the team out here, to the audience. Any of your vendors should have this and should have this readily available. So confirm with your vendors. It should take just a quick second to turn that around. If it takes them more than that, you'd be a little skeptical, but verify that, and they can send you the document and it'll show their coverage, their amounts. One, it covers you, right, in case something does happen. But don't be afraid to ask for that. They should have that information readily available.
And just to carry on to that point, just like having car insurance is not a license to drive recklessly, right? We still, stop at stop signs, not just because we could be pulled over. Cyber liability insurance, it's not a reason to skip the preparedness steps. I mean, many of these policies are going to require that you have a lot of those things in place, and that's a good thing, because it can get the budget lined up and kind of clear the path. But certainly think of this as, okay, this is what I'm doing for the catastrophic scenario. There are a lot of those fender bender scenarios, though, that just a little bit of effort up front can prevent from becoming a big headache.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thank you. So, team, I do want to talk a little bit about how Otava can help the folks on the call today better protect and prepare and ensure that you are appropriately mitigating risk from a security and a cyber attack perspective. Otava, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, is a secure and compliant cloud provider. We do have a fairly robust suite of tools to help in this. And we ourselves obviously are also compliant with a number of leading requirements out there, including HIPAA, PCI, high trust, and then obviously the data center compliance requirements as one would expect. I won't spend too much time here today, but what I do want to talk to you about is a little bit about our security offering specifically. I'll start with backup. Backup is not a security offering in and of itself, but is a core component to any good security strategy, multi-layer security strategy. And in the Otava world, right, that includes multiple things, including 365, which, as we know again today, Microsoft does not secure. Microsoft does not back up, and it also does not provide any or very limited recoverability should something occur there. So as more and more of our information and our productivity work move into a 365 environment, be it Teams, be it SharePoint, be it any of the Office traditional applications on OneDrive, etc., we need to make sure that that information is protected. Likewise, also your business applications and data through either our cloud backup or from a remote location, our Cloud Connect portfolio. But what I do want to talk about, and Jason, you alluded to this earlier, is really our compliance framework here. Could you take us through Otava's vision for a true compliant framework for both of these, but then in security in general?
Yeah, happy to. And what this does for us, this gives us our framework to work from. And it's not just a solutioning perspective, but it's a holistic perspective, because that's how we approach these compliances. And something I'd like to add to just what Otava does and has done for many, many years is that it's just not Jeremy and Jason saying, yes, we'll show you some graphics of, what we adhere to. We're actually audited by a third party. So we have all those reports available, and that's part of the framework here, as you're seeing on the screen. I really like these, and something else we do on the pre-sale side, we get an architect involved. We walk through this. So if anybody would call and say, yes, I'm struggling with PCI, or I want to get out of the HIPAA business, we have this framework to work around. As you work through this, we're really doing it from a top down. As you can see here, from the edge all the way down to recovery. And some of these are optional services, but all are recommended depending on what type of compliancy you're concerned about. From data encryption to log review to file integrity monitoring, which is very key and one of the 12 requirements of PCI, to vol scans on the outside. As well as doing threat analysis on the inside, like I mentioned earlier, with a tool like Nessus that you can do yourself. MFA is an integral part of all this, and depending on if you're an app dev shop, maybe you have a WAF, a web application firewall in there. So what we do is we take this framework and we work down the solution set, apply it to the principles and the framework for the particular compliance, and develop a complete solution. As long as with what's on the right-hand side, that's really when I said holistically, it's not just solution sets, it's the processes that we take here. It's how we're audited. It's our BAAs if it's a HIPAA pursuit, and or change management documentation. All of that falls into a compliancy and how we're regulated. So very good framework to work from, and it's very easy. We try to make it very easy to understand and consumable. I know there was a question earlier about elevating that conversation. We like to put it in this format, so one, you can talk to it visibly with a C-suite, so they understand what we're trying to achieve here, and take an account, like for PCI, the 12 requirements of PCI and how they're applied to data flows through the organization, and then holistically.
Fantastic. One of the things, team, that I will reinforce from a Otava perspective is again, Seth, I think you mentioned this, right? This is a journey, and it's a journey that is a continuous evolution, right? There's not a one and done. It's not something I can put on the shelf and revisit, every couple of years, right? This is something that is an ongoing, pervasive. As our business changes, so also must our security posture and our approach to how we're securing our business change to keep alignment with where we are from an organizational perspective. To that end, I would invite each and every one of you, right? If you're looking at embarking on that journey, or if you're already in that journey and going through that process, let's have a conversation. Let's understand where you are, what challenges you're facing, what successes you've already had, and let's see if we can't help you accelerate and better protect and mitigate some of the risks that you still may be facing in your organization, or understand how we can bring in additional layers or levels to your existing security posture to just make sure that you are more accurately protected and easier to recover from should an unexpected event occur. So that is my close for today. I do want to thank you for your time and for your participation. We have about 5 minutes left. I do want to open this up for any questions that you may have. If not today on the webinar, again, feel free to reach out to us, engage us. We're happy to talk to you. Jason and his team are the ones you would be speaking to, and really let's work together to see how we can better protect your organizations moving forward. So with that said, any questions, feel free to put that into your Q&A panel in the webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day. All right, folks, appreciate the time. As a close to today, all of you will receive a copy of this content. So you'll get the deck as a takeaway from this. And as always, look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great day now.
Take care, guys.
Take care.